So happy to have you all here today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jeff Carr. I am the Senior Director for External Affairs here at the Museum of Idaho, and it is my pleasure as one of my job functions to be able to oversee this wonderful lecture series, Museum Club, and looking forward to our presentation today very much. It has worked out rather well to have this be an online-only presentation for a number of reasons. Our speaker today is joining us from California, for one. Second, Omicron is right here with us, and it seems like just about everybody I know has it right now. And third, our East Room of our Make Education Center, where we like to hold our lectures in person, is currently being used as part of our exhibit transition. So we don't even have access to the room right now anyway. On that note, a couple of announcements for those of you who are members of the Museum of Idaho. We will be holding this evening, actually in just about an hour, from 4 to 8 today, we will be holding our members-only preview of our brand new exhibit, Genghis Khan Conquest and Culture. And so if you come in between 4 and 8 today, we'll give you a little stamp on your hand and you can be the very first people to see this wonderful new exhibit. It is gorgeous and a lot of fun. So love to see any and all of you museum members here. If anyone out there is not a museum member, but is in the area, we are happy to have you stop by and become a member today, and we'll let you right on in. So our VIP exhibit opening party for Genghis Khan is tomorrow evening, also for some of our most generous donors and corporate partners. And I'm sure some of you on this call are on the honored guest list there as well. And we appreciate your support of the Museum of Idaho. We will be opening this wonderful new exhibit on Saturday to the public. So at the very least, we'll have you all starting then on Saturday. Anyhow, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Judge Lisa Pearlman. So Judge Pearlman took up writing and lecturing after a career as a lawyer and a judge, of course. She grew up in Connecticut and graduated from Yale in 1971, the first class to admit women undergraduates, which is pretty cool. Not cool that it took that long, of course, but a pioneer in your own right. She then moved to California, where she attended Berkeley Law School, met her husband, also a lawyer, and raised 3 daughters. In the past decade, she has written 5 history books that have won multiple awards in the categories of law, U.S. history, multicultural nonfiction, and social change. Her latest book, The Lindbergh Kidnapping Suspect #1, The Man Who Got Away. And by the way, you should ask her about this in the Q&A session, because it sounds to me like she may have figured this mystery out. Anyhow, this latest book won the 2021 Book Excellence Award for True Crime. The biography she authored in 2018, Call Me Phaedra, The Life and Times of Movement Lawyer Faye Stender, won the 2018 International Book Award for Biographies. And an earlier book, American Justice on Trial, People v. Newton, is also a companion to a nonprofit documentary project of the same name, for which Pearlman serves as a producer. And that project won a Civil Rights Award and is expected to be completed and released this spring. Congratulations on that. But she is here today to talk about a sensational early 20th century Idaho trial that she wrote about in 2 of her other books. One is called With Justice for Some, Politically Charged Criminal Trials of the Early 20th Century that Helped Shape Today's America. And the second is called The Sky's the Limit, People v. Newton, The Real Trial of the 20th Century, ? And Judge Pearlman reached out to me a few months ago after visiting the Museum of Idaho, and stopped by, and we were able to talk via email, and she was surprised, rightly so, that we don't talk enough about this incredible trial in our Way Out West exhibit. So she is here to fill in the gaps for us, to talk about the 1907 no-holds-barred Idaho trial of the century. And without further ado, we will turn the time over to Lisa Pearlman.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction, Jeff, and I appreciate the invitation from the Museum of Idaho. So let's get started. I just out of curiosity, how many people are familiar with this case? Can you see? Maybe you, okay, a few, maybe. All right, so let's see if we can get it to, what? It's not moving. Uh-oh. That's weird. Jeff, it's not moving. Let's try.
The slides are not advancing. Is that
there? Now we go. Okay, it did. All right. So J. Anthony Lucas was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. And before he approached the researching and writing about this 1907 Idaho trial, and he wrote a thick book, 700 plus pages, called Big Trouble. And he brought in, with him an idea of what the trial of the century should look like. And I used that same one in my book. A spectacular show trial, a great national drama, one in which the stakes are nothing less than the soul of the American people. And his candidate for that was this trial in Idaho, the trial of Big Bill Haywood. It was the first of 3 trials that were scheduled for the leaders of the Western Federation of Miners, which I will sometimes call WFM, who faced the death penalty in 1907 for allegedly ordering the murder of retired Governor Frank Steinbergs. Big Bill Haywood is in the center in this photo. This trial had the attention of President Teddy Roosevelt. And so he was using his bully pulpit to call them undesirable citizens. And he was talking about these 3 leaders. And I have a photo here of a lot of immigrants who were coming in by the millions at the time as new workers in the country. And they took umbrage really at Roosevelt's description, because they thought that these men represented their interests, and so that they would have to be called undesirable citizens too. At the time, Roosevelt, you may be aware, was considered a progressive trust buster, but he also vehemently opposed radical unionizers. So he took very keen interest in this trial. Here is a picture of the first defendant, Bill Haywood. He was called the Lincoln of Labor. He was born in 1869 in the Utah Territory. His father was a Pony Express rider, but died when Haywood was 3. Haywood was 9 when he lost his right eye in a whittling accident, the same year he started working in the mines. As an adult, he had the intimidating look of a real-life cyclops. He had never bothered to obtain a glass eye and wore a tall cowboy hat to tower over companions. Without the hat, he was just under 6 feet. When photographed, he presented a half profile with only his good left eye facing the camera. He was 27 when he joined the WFM in 1896 and rose quickly to national prominence as a champion of labor's goals, shouting to enthusiastic crowds, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of play, 8 hours of sleep. By May of 1907, he had served on the executive board of the WFM for 7 years. So what is the issue underlying this case? Labor versus capital. After the Civil War, the United States entered into a new era of industrialization, employing both American labor and an influx of immigrant workers. From 1870 to 1900, almost 12 million immigrants came to the United States. In the 70s and 80s, most came from Northern Europe. Workers grew to hate the big businessmen who exploited them. In the mines, injuries went uncompensated, health benefits did not exist, and disabled workers simply lost their jobs and were replaced with others equally desperate for employment. So let's go back to the history of the 8-hour day movement. It had its origins in the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain that transformed working life into long hours at factories for low wages, 10 to 16 hours a day, under unregulated working conditions. The slogan, 8 hours labor, 8 hours a recreation, 8 hours rest, was coined by a Welsh reformer in 1817. Women and children in England were granted the 10-hour day in 1847. French workers won the 12-hour day after the Revolution of 1848. In the United States, by the 1830s, there was a general demand for a 10-hour day, which quickly turned to demands for an 8-hour day. During the 1870s, numerous 8-hour leagues held rallies and parades. Yet when Haywood took up their rallying cry, little progress had been made. So there's another aspect to what was going on in the 1870s and thereafter, and that is the invention by Alfred Nobel of dynamite. The mining industry in the late 19th century made extensive use of dynamite as a commercial blasting technique. Miners typically worked 10 hours a day, six days a week, down dangerous shafts. 1/3 of all men who worked a decade in gold and silver mines wound up seriously injured from falling rocks or from inhaling clouds of silica dust sent up by what they called widowmaker compressed air drills. 1 out of 8 died in the mines. And besides the demand for an 8-hour day, mine workers demanded safety regulations and a $3 minimum daily wage. So you can see that after it was patented, it was used worldwide, not only for blasting mines and railway lines, but ports, bridges, roads, and tunnels. Became a huge success, and all the money that Nobel made, eventually he decided to fund the Nobel Prize, various prizes. So I just wanted to share with you, these are railroad workers in an 1875 strike, and in the photograph here, or the painting. This is one of the songs that was written at the time about their hard life. I recall as a kid knowing about that song, and what impressed me the most about it was that it said that he was docked for the time that he was thrown up in the sky by an explosion. That was part of their, I guess you say, almost like gallows humor. So the next event that I wanted to talk about was the infamous Haymarket Square riot, which broke out on May Day, 1886. And this was the day after police and private detectives killed 6 strikers. Bill Haywood paid close attention to newspaper accounts of this event. He was 17 at the time. But at the May Day gathering, an unknown protester threw a bomb at the police, who responded by shooting into the crowd, some of whom returned gunfire. 7 policemen and 3 protesters were killed. About 100 others were injured, most of them police officers. 8 leading anarchists and militant socialists who gave speeches at the May Day rally were tried for murder and convicted based solely on charges that the deaths were the bloody fruit of their villainous teachings. 4 were hanged in 1887. The executions turned these men into instant martyrs for their cause. So what was going on in Idaho? Well, there were major confrontations starting between the miners and the mine owners. In 1892, President Benjamin Harrison imposed martial law at the request of Republican Governor Norman Willey. And then the miners helped start a new federation in order to have clout against the owners. And one of the worst events was in 1894 when 40 masked men executed a witness against the miners in a trial that was taking place for striker violence that had occurred in 1892. And then Democratic President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops to northern Idaho in 1894. Well, I want to go back to 1893 and talk about what was going on nationally. It was a real monetary crisis. There was railroad overbuilding and bankruptcy, bank runs and failures, a run on the gold supply. and it turned out to be the worst depression to date in US history. And that left an awful lot of men unemployed, which meant there was a lot of competition for the jobs in the mines. During this time, the Western Federation of Miners was founded. And the reason they did that was, again, to have the small unions have much more clout. They had unions in Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Utah, and South Dakota. They all merged to form the Western Federation of Miners, which was immediately known as the most militant union in the whole country. But meanwhile, management was infiltrating unions with spies and was resorting to private armies to break strikes and use rifles to kill strikers with impunity. Union members fought back with sabotage and violence against scabs. So there were wage cuts, there were strike breakers, there were armed company guards, and mass arrests all going on during this time. Now, this is the national election that is an important part of what the background is for this trial. William Jennings Bryan ran for president several times. This was his first effort at it. He was only 36, and he lost to Republican William McKinley. But what is probably something you might be aware of is a famous speech he made, and that's why it's got a sketch of him, a cartoon with a cross of gold, because Bryan was the champion of the farmers and workers and small business owners who believed that there ought to be a silver standard in the country that would pump far more money into the economy than relying on the traditional gold standard that was favored by bankers and investors and industrialists. So I'm just going to give you a small sample of his speech. He fired his audiences up to a fever pitch. If they dare to defend the gold standard as a good thing, we shall fight them to the uttermost. We shall answer their demands by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. At the time, newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst focused more on the role of huge campaign donations in this election for the Republican candidate. Political boss Mark Hanna raised an unparalleled $3.5 million, which would be about $93 million today, for McKinley. And that launched the modern era of political fundraising. Of course, McKinley won, but also Democrat Frank Steinbergs was elected governor in Idaho. And that was with the backing of union members and the vote of silver Republicans. So he was the first non-Republican to hold that office since Idaho was admitted to the Union in 1890. Steinbergs would be reelected in 1898 with a smaller majority, but it still included Union support. So let's move to the most pivotal event in Steinbergs' second term. In Wardener, Idaho, there was a smelting plant with a concentrator that was recognized when it was built as the largest such facility on the entire planet. The owner not only refused to recognize unions, but began purging Irish miners from his workforce, calling them un-American agitators. On April 29, 1899, local union members armed with rifles, bats, and shotguns commandeered a train that they diverted to Wardener and placed 60 dynamite cartons under the concentrator. Then all of the men hightailed it out of Wardener just before the explosives blew the concentrator to smithereens. The union's extraordinary violence shocked Governor Steinbergs. At the demands of the Irate Railroad and Coeur d'Alene mine owners, the governor reimposed martial law to restore order. With his own National Guard off serving in the Spanish-American War, Steinbergs asked President McKinley to deploy federal troops. Within days, the president sent veteran Black soldiers in the segregated 24th Infantry to quell the uprising by locking up Union members and sympathizing townsmen in the Coeur d'Alene region. Well, the only way that they could try to justify this was by imposing martial law. because otherwise the Constitution said that there is a privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and it shall not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So there was a big issue of the constitutionality of what had just taken place, because the men were rounded up and couldn't even go to court to try to prove they had no basis for arresting them. The French, Canadian, Irish, Welsh, and Cornish locals who were herded into bullpens, which were smelly and ridden with vermin, without charges, were incensed. Meanwhile, Idaho's Attorney General, Samuel Hayes, boasted to the press, "We have taken the Union monster by the throat and we're going to choke the life out of it." Republican governors had previously authorized mass arrests, but this time the roundup was followed by a new county permit requiring all miners to renounce membership in any militant union. This was squarely directed at the WFM with the approval of Steinberg. Union men called Steinberg a Benedict Arnold. The WFM had enough national clout to get Steinberg summoned to Washington to answer charges of misconduct in suspending the constitutional rights of Idaho citizens. Yet the Republican majority stood firmly behind Steinberg. To the WFM, this was the final indignity. Steinberg was condemned as an enemy of the working class. Death threats against Steinberg followed, and at the end of his second term, he retreated to private life as a farmer, banker, and real estate developer. In the election of 1900, McKinley was again challenged by Bryan and won again handily, now with New York Governor Teddy Roosevelt as his running mate. And Roosevelt had been the hero of the recent Spanish-American War. This time, however, there was a third candidate, Eugene Debs, who ran as a socialist. So let's talk a little bit about Debs. Debs would eventually run 5 times as a socialist for president. He had started out as a Democrat who led his union in a major strike against the railroad in 1888 and helped found the American Railway Union. In the 1890s, he led a boycott that became the nationwide Pullman strike. It affected more than 250,000 workers in 27 states. President Grover Cleveland used the army to break the strike, and Debs was convicted of defying a court injunction and served 6 months in prison, which was where he read up on socialism and became a socialist. Well, 6 months after he was reelected, McKinley was at an international fair in New York State, and he was shot, an international exposition, and it was headline news and everywhere and shocking to the country. Well, what happened? McKinley was inside this building pictured here, shaking hands with well-wishers, when an unemployed worker named Leon Czolgosz shot him with a mail-order gun from Sears Roebuck. The painting depicts what happened. Former slave Big Ben Parker is pictured in the middle, heroically wrestling Czolgosz to the ground and preventing a third shot, which potentially would have saved the president's life. But the president received botched medical care and gangrene set in, and he died a week later. Most people reacted with shock and horror. Yet anarchists rejoice at the death of a leader they considered a tool of the money kings. Czolgosz was hurriedly tried and executed for the crime, and the nation had a new president, Theodore Roosevelt. So shortly after President Roosevelt took office, there was another crisis in the West, and this became labeled the Colorado Labor Wars. In 1903 to 1904, there were pitched battles between the WFM and state-supported mine owners. And this was the closest historians believe that the United States ever approached outright class warfare. It was a series of violent labor strikes in 1903 and 1904 in Colorado by gold and silver miners, those workers in coal and mill workers. And it was followed by imposition of martial law by the Colorado National Guard. The state government almost always sided with the owners. The mine owners associations also relied on vigilantes and brought in private detectives, including the Pinkerton Agency. In 1904, in just one incident, 13 strikebreakers had died in a bombing at a Colorado train station. Rumor blamed Big Bill Haywood. The Union claimed the bomb had been set off by a provocateur acting for mine owners. By then, use of provocateurs was well documented, but so was murder and mayhem by the mine workers. Back in Washington, D.C., in April of 1905, a case was heard that would have a huge impact for the next 30 years in America, and that was Lochner versus New York. Lochner was one of the most controversial decisions in the history of the Supreme Court, and it gave its name to what was known as the Lochner era. Reformers in several states had succeeded in getting some protective laws for workers passed, only to see a bare majority of justices throw out a New York law limiting bakers' hours to 60-hour weeks. The court said, the majority, that this was an interference with freedom of contract, as if there were equal bargaining on both sides, which everyone knew wasn't true. The landmark ruling protected owners' property interests in imposing working conditions that progressive legislatures deemed inhumane. Soon, a host of other new laws for worker protection were invalidated, but the most immediate impact of the Lochner ruling was to galvanize the founding of the Revolutionary International Workers of the World in June of 1905, just a couple months later. Eugene Debs was one of its founding members, as was Charles Moyer, who was the president of the WFM, and Big Bill Haywood, who chaired the conference. It was just that winter that Steinberg was assassinated, just 6 months after the IWW was formed. Steinberg was returning from a walk to his home in Caldwell on a snowy evening, and he entered through the side gate that he did not know had just been booby-trapped. He was blown 10 feet into the air by an explosion that shook the earth and could be heard for miles around. Within an hour, Steinberg was dead. Immediately, before there were any arrests, the charges were laid to the murderous strikers. That was the assumption of the newspapers and the authorities. And at that point, the mine owners secretly gave Idaho's governor the funds necessary to hire Pinkerton's chief detective in its Denver office, James McParland, to investigate the explosion. It wasn't very long after the explosion that there was an arrest, and this is before McParland arrived. There was a stranger in town, going by the name of T.J. Hogan, and he was arrested for murder 2 days after a search of his hotel room turned up traces of material used in making the bomb. Hogan denied guilt, but admitted his name was actually Harry Orchard, and that he had once lived in the Coeur d'Alene mining region and knew the WFM leadership. So McParland comes to town, and Orchard's already under arrest. McParland was at the time the most famous private eye in America. He already had experience with the Colorado labor wars, and the mine owners now kept him on retainer. At this point, he was in his 60s, but he had catapulted to national fame almost 30 years before for his role in destroying another militant mine workers organization in Pennsylvania, when he was working undercover to expose a gang of Irish Americans known as the Molly Maguires. Arriving in Boise in January of 1906, McParland first met with Idaho Governor Frank Gooding to share his suspicion that Orchard was the tool of others. So what was it that had made him famous? Well, the Molly Maguires created a situation in Western Pennsylvania that differed little from that in the West at the turn of the century. Labor was at war with capital, Democrat with Republican, Protestant with Catholic, and immigrant with Native. McParland's testimony against the Molly Maguires helped clinch 20 hangings on what was called Black Thursday, June 21, 1877. And 3 decades later, Irish Catholics still scorn McParland as a traitor to his people. So McParland goes to visit Orchard in jail, And he obtains a confession by assuring Orchard that the state was really after the WFM inner circle. Orchard then implicated Big Bill Haywood, President Charles Moyer, and WFM executive board member George Pettibone. Orchard claimed that the three men gave him instructions in Denver to go to Idaho to kill Steinberg as an example to other political enemies that they could never escape revenge. Orchard said it was only the latest of many terrorist acts he performed for the WFM. Well, the Constitution does not permit extradition of a person in one state to another state when that person hadn't been in the state that wanted him charged. So you have this problem. It says that a person who shall flee from justice and be found in another state shall, on demand of the governor, the executive authority of the state from which he fled, in this case, supposedly Idaho, be delivered to be removed up. Well, they got over that problem by a subterfuge. The governor of Idaho met with McParland and met with the governor of Colorado. And they each, they gave instructions. They may not have all met in person, but McParland met with both of them. And what they did was they created paperwork that said, affidavits that said these men had been in Idaho on the night of the bombing and had fled to Colorado. And therefore they were fugitives from justice. And the collusion also involved the Union Pacific Railroad. So what happened? Well, it was later called the Pirate Express, but the three men were arrested in Denver and immediately shackled and put on a train that was dubbed the Pirate Special and brought directly to Idaho and placed in cells on death row already while awaiting trial for Steinberg's murder. The governor of Idaho then publicly asserted his belief in their guilt, and McParland boasted in a press release, "They will never leave Idaho alive." Eugene Debs shot back, "If they don't, the governors of Idaho and Colorado and their masters from Wall Street, New York to the Rocky Mountains had better prepare to follow them." Meanwhile, the WFM's lead lawyer, Edmund Richardson in Denver, caught the first train he could get for Idaho to challenge the abduction of his clients. Meanwhile, the press on the side of the WFM was contending that they were innocent, their only crime was loyalty to the working class, and that they'd been illegally kidnapped, which was true. And they were going to be tried for murder when they shouldn't have even been in the state of Idaho to face those charges. One of the leaders of this group of defenders of the WFM was Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones. Mary Harris Jones gave the name to the new magazine here we have today called Mother Jones. She had been a co-founder of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, in June of 1905. She'd been a labor organizer for many years before that. She was then in her late 60s, a widow, and she had been branded the most dangerous woman in America. She was a proud socialist, most famous for leading a children's crusade in 1903 from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to President Roosevelt's estate in Long Island to protest the exploitation of child labor, which was still very common. Mother Jones campaigned hard since the 1870s for the rights of mine workers. And so in 1906, she was doing what she always liked to do. She traveled across the country fundraising for her colleagues. And in this case, it was the leadership of the WFM. Meanwhile, the lawyers for the WFM had managed to get their suit all the way up to the US Supreme Court, challenging the arrests and the extradition of the three men. But they really didn't have much chance given the political pressure of the day. At the Justice's annual White House visit on the Monday of the week the High Court began its 1906 fall term, Roosevelt asserted his opinion to the justices directly that Moyer and Haywood were undesirable citizens, just 3 days before the oral argument on their case. Roosevelt could not resist a heavy-handed hint as to how he hoped they would rule. James Hawley was the key lawyer for the state in that argument. So the opinion issued 2 months later, and there was only one dissenter, and the court ruled that any challenge to the illegality of the kidnapping had to occur in Colorado. Once the men were transported to Idaho, Idaho had authority to try them for conspiracy to assassinate its ex-governor. It is often said that possession is 9/10 of the law. In this case, possession was 10/10 of the law. The men had no opportunity to challenge their kidnapping in Colorado. Eugene Debs linked McParland and the 2 governors with the capitalist tyrants. He threatened if they attempt to murder Moyer, Haywood, and Pettibone and their brothers, 1,000,000 revolutionists will meet them with guns. Colorado Socialist Party named Haywood its candidate for governor while he sat in his Idaho jail cell facing murder charges. Just before trial was to start in May, there were major parades in cities across country. One of them in Chicago actually featured a widow from the Haymarket Square, which was back, almost 30 years earlier, because they connected these events and the martyrdom and the expected martyrdom of these men. And so I wanted to play for you again the Marseillaise, which was not only sung at these parades, and there were many thousands in New York and many down Fifth Avenue, many thousands in Boston on the Commons. And the Marseillaise had been used by Russian workers as their theme song in 1905. And so it became a workers' anthem. So here, we're just going to play a little bit of it. Let's see if we can get it to.
Right there.
You get the flavor of it. And this is all the way down Fifth Avenue. It was a very impressive display nationwide. I mean, this is before radio, let alone television. And so there was all this interest focused on Idaho. So here's the prosecution team. James Hawley, who had been involved in the appeal, and William Borah were the 2 lead lawyers and in the prosecution. Hawley was 61 years old at the time. He liked to call himself an Idaho bar leader. And Senator William Borah had just been elected to the US Senate. Hawley was the most experienced trial lawyer in the state of Idaho and perhaps the country. But he liked to dress casually and chew on a toothpick with his boots on the tabletop. And he was famous for his ability to relate to Idaho juries as if they were his neighbors. He had once been a miner himself and had served in the territorial legislature. From 1903 to 1905, he was actually mayor of Boise. In 1910, he would become governor. Senator Borah was a contrast to him. He was a renowned ladies' man, a generation younger than Hawley, and he'd been a close friend of Governor Steinbergs. After moving to Idaho in 1890, Borah had built a very lucrative law practice representing timber barons, ranchers, mine operators, and other businessmen. He had turned to politics by 1896. He was the leader of Idaho's Silver Republicans, who supported Frank Steinbergs' campaign for governor. Bora and Hawley had teamed up successfully before in prosecuting mine workers for the 1899 bombing in Coeur d'Alene. Both felt they now had an ironclad case for hanging the WFM's national leaders. So who were the defense lawyers? Well, Edmund Richardson was expecting to be the lead lawyer in the defense, and his firm had for years been the primary lawyers for the WFM in Denver. He liked to wear, always wore, a three-piece suit, even through the hottest days of summer. And he looked and acted much different from his co-counsel from Chicago, labor lawyer Clarence Daryl, who had been asked to participate by Eugene Debs. Both had outsized egos, and a reporter for the Denver Post observed, "Two stars of the same magnitude cannot occupy the same orbit." At one point, Daryl threatened to quit the defense team. After the trial, Daryl would refer to Richardson as "that ass, my former associate," and told the reporter he was very hard to get along with, very egotistical, arrogant, and exceedingly jealous. So I want to go into the background a little bit of Clarence Daryl, because this was the case that made him nationally famous. But up until then, he was connected to the labor movement in the Chicago area. He arrived in Chicago from rural Ohio a year after the Haymarket rally and the hanging of 4 of the speakers. 3 of the 8 remained in prison in 1898 when he successfully sought their pardon from a new Democratic governor of Illinois for lack of proof that these men were involved in the bombing itself. Daryl had become Eugene Debs' lawyer 4 years before, when Debs faced criminal conspiracy charges for leading the 1894 Pullman Railroad strike. So that was his background. And when he was asked by Debs to help represent the 3 accused WFM leaders, he was very well known already in Illinois as a passionate opponent of the death penalty and, of course, a champion of labor and underdog causes. But he'd never been to Boise, and he expected to face open hostility there for defending the radical Union men accused of assassinating their former governor. Daryl had just published a booklet on the virtues of turning the other cheek. Biographer Irving Stone notes that Daryl went to Boise with his eyes open. He knew that it would be the toughest case of his career, a knock 'em down and drag 'em out brawl with no holds barred. So the judge for this case was Fremont Wood, and neither side had any objections to his appointment. The Republican jurist was an imposing Yankee from Maine who had been a former U.S. attorney. He was known for his even-handed rulings, and the first thing he did was to please the defense, actually, by granting their motion for a change of venue to Boise from Caldwell, because the town was too inflamed for a fair trial to take place in Caldwell. So this is where Caldwell is marked on the map. It was moved to Boise. This is the courthouse that it was moved to. And before trial, one of Orchard's alleged collaborators had disappeared without a trace. Another one, Steve Adams, retracted his own confession at the urging of Clarence Daryl. Detective McParland suspected that Daryl bribed Adams, but he had no proof. Prior to trial, the defense team added to their table a prominent Boise lawyer who had once been Judge Wood's partner. They also seated Haywood's crippled wife and freckle-faced 9-year-old daughter in the front row of spectators, along with his mother and older daughter. The prosecution team also looked for sympathy, but Steinbergs' widow refused to attend the trial. For protection against assassination, Idaho's Governor Gooding moved his family to the same hotel as McParland, both under armed guard. Gooding also obtained federal reinforcements for the city and secretly encouraged armed vigilantes among local businessmen. For extra insurance, the prosecutor placed a sniper in the attic of a grocery store with a clear view of the courthouse. This was a trial covered nationally, and in order to prepare for it, Western Union had to beef up its office in Boise. Mainstream and leftist media swarmed to cover it, and Boston Globe called it a determined struggle between labor unions and capital. Socialists deemed it the greatest trial of modern times. Debs wanted to cover it himself for his weekly socialist newspaper, but Daryl emphatically told Debs to stay away. It would be hard enough to defend the three WFM leaders without turning the trial into a referendum on socialism. So here we have again J. Anthony Lucas's definition: a spectacular show trial, a great national drama, one in which the stakes are nothing less than the soul of the American people. And in fact, at the time, a reporter for the Boise Statesman claimed, "The eyes of the civilized world are on these great proceedings." So the jury selection was key. It proved time consuming. There were nearly 250 jurors, potential jurors, questioned over more than 6 weeks. Idaho actually was one of the few states where women were eligible to serve, but few ever got chosen. None would serve in this case. Daryl himself never sat women on jury panels in Illinois because he believed that the suffragettes who showed up for jury duty favored prosecutors. Potential jurors were asked what they thought of labor unions, what church they belonged to, and other questions aimed at revealing their political affiliations. Among other subjects, Daryl asked if they would vote to hang an anarchist. One candidate responded, "Yes, if I understand what an anarchist is, I would hang him on sight." Daryl's limited juror choices in Boise prohibited him from following his usual formula for success in Chicago trials. Never take a German, they are bullheaded. Rarely take a Swede, they are stubborn. Always take an Irishman or a Jew, they are the easiest to move to an emotional sympathy. The two sides ultimately agreed on 12 men. All had started out as farmers or ranchers. 11 were over 50. Daryl's other rule of thumb was old men are generally more charitable and kindly disposed than young men. They have seen more of the world and understand it. 8 were Republicans, 3 Democrats, 1 a prohibitionist. The men were sequestered for the duration of the trial and permitted to read newspapers only after deputies cut out any coverage of the case. Both teams had secretly conducted extensive investigation of eligible jurors, but the defense team belatedly discovered that their chief intelligence gatherer was actually a Pinkerton spy who skewed his reports and sent the other side copies. By the time the process was complete, the prosecution was satisfied, but the defense was only hoping for a hung jury. Most of the men had voted for, done business with, or otherwise had been familiar with Governor Steinberg, including one juror who boarded the governor in his Boise home for 2 years. Only one had ever been a member of a trade union. Socialist papers were even more pessimistic. They assumed the panel had already made up their minds to do the prosecution's bidding. Prosecutor William Barr deliberately sought to inflame the jury with his claim that the trial was for a crime 1,000 times worse than murder. It was anarchy displaying its first bloody triumph in Idaho. A parade of prosecution witnesses took the stand to describe Steinberg's violent, agonizing death and the poorly groomed strangers spotted casing the farmhouse before him. And then we come to Orchard himself taking the stand. A 40-year-old Canadian, his real name was Albert Horsley. He arrived in the packed courtroom accompanied by armed guards. Inside the courtroom, deputies and plainclothes detectives provided additional security. Over the 16 months since Orchard's arrest, McParland had transformed him from an unshaven, ill-kempt, shifty-eyed felon to a carefully attired and manicured man who might be a Sunday school superintendent. The remarkably composed star witness then testified in a low, credible monotone for several days, detailing his career as a Union terrorist, ending with his claim that Haywood, Moyer, and Pettibone promised him several $100s and a ranch if he assassinated Steinberg to intimidate other WFM adversaries. The Western Union office worked at a record pace to transmit the news to the nation from the hordes of mainstream and socialist reporters who had descended on Boise to cover the story firsthand. Collier's Weekly magazine described Orchard as the most remarkable witness that ever appeared in an American court of justice. New York Times correspondent O.K. Davis proclaimed that the witness upon whose testimony the whole case against Haywood, Moyer, and the other leaders of the Western Federation of Miners is based told a horrible, revolting, sickening story as simply as the plainest, most ordinary incident. And as it went on, hour after hour, clear and vivid here, half forgotten and obscure there, gradually it forced home to the listener the conviction that it was the unmixed truth. Meanwhile, observers could not help but notice that Edmund Richardson had difficulty sharing the leadership of the defense team with Daryl. Daryl reluctantly deferred to Richardson when he insisted on cross-examining Orchard. Richardson did score some points. Orchard claimed to be a paid assassin of the Union, but acknowledged that some of the misdeeds he committed were on his own initiative or that of the mine owners. Yet most observers believed Orchard won that courtroom matchup very easily. In the next trial of WFM's George Pettibone, when Orchard was again the chief witness, Daryl conducted the cross-examination himself. He was credited with doing a masterful job of discrediting Orchard as a convicted felon, bigamist, company spy, and tool of Pinkerton's agency. The jury reportedly responded by recoiling from Orchard as if he were the carcass of a dead animal, but not in this trial. When they were not in court, and this was now the middle of July and very hot, they liked to relax by going to watch local baseball games. And so here is where Daryl went. He went to see a young man named Walter Johnson, who was reputed to be a phenomenal pitcher who was playing for the Idaho State League in Weiser, Idaho on the Snake River during the time of the trial. Actually, in that summer, Johnson signed a contract with the Washington Senators and became the premier pitcher of the entire era for Major League Baseball, among the first 5 men inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame. So they gave him a little pleasure to the lawyers to be able to watch him during breaks. Meanwhile, the judge, for his relaxation, took fishing trips, and unbeknownst to the parties, the judge went with O.K. Davis, who was the New York Times reporter, on weekend fly fishing trips. And when they talked about the trial, which they did, and this would not be proper in today's world, but he was able to do this back then, the judge agreed with Davis's assessment of Orchard's credibility. Yet the judge was aware that none of the state's other witnesses was able to corroborate that Haywood ordered Orchard to plant the bomb that killed Steinbergs. So Haywood gets to take the stand after the prosecution put on its case. And before Haywood got on the stand, there were 100 other witnesses that the defense had put on. And Haywood denied all of Orchard's charges. And of course, he took the most interest of the audience when he took the stand. But he got up there in a soft-spoken voice, conversational tone, and denied that he had ever ordered Orchard to blow up a mine or assassinate Steinbergs or any other public official. When Senator Borah cross-examined Haywood, Haywood focused steadfastly on the prosecutor with his one eye. For 5 hours, Borah tried and failed to crack Haywood. Borah later said that Haywood's stare doubled me up like a jackknife. Closing arguments, it was customary at the time to last up to a day and a half per lawyer. The courtroom was filled to capacity, and the judge allowed each of them that much time. Governor Gooding and James McParland showed up for the first time to watch this, and so did the widow. Hawley went first, attributing Orchard's confession to the saving power of divine grace. He denied that the state sought to make war on the WFM or that the mine owners had a role in financing the prosecution, which these statements Hawley knew to be false. He had taken a very active role himself in fundraising to rid the West entirely of the WFM. Edmund Richardson went first for the defense, wearing his 3-piece suit and lecturing the jury from a distance. He suggested that Orchard might have acted out of personal grudge against the governor for the outrages committed by the colored troops brought in to corral miners Orchard had befriended in Coeur d'Alene. Alternatively, Richardson suggested that Pinkerton's agency hired Orchard as a provocateur to kill Steinbergs and misdirect blame to the WFM leadership. Daryl got up and he sensed the jury had already made up its mind to convict Haywood. And instead, he made a moving closing argument attacking the prosecution as a conspiracy to behead the WFM, hoping to get a hung jury. The unconventional, shaggy-haired Chicagoan doffed his jacket and thumbed his suspenders in animated conversational style within arm's length of the jury. He spoke passionately for 11 hours and ended with a sterling defense of self-sacrifice in class struggle. Other men have died in the same cause in which Bill Haywood has risked his life. Men strong with devotion, men who love liberty, men who love their fellow men have raised their voices in defense of the poor, in defense of justice, have made their good fight and have met death on the scaffold, on the rack, in the flame, and they will meet it again until the world grows old and gray. Bill Haywood is no better than the rest. He can die if die he needs. He can die if this jury decrees it. But oh, gentlemen, don't think for a moment that if you hang him, you will crucify the labor movement of the world. Think you there are no brave hearts, no other strong arms, no other devoted souls who will risk all in that great cause which has demanded martyrs in every land and age? By the time he finished, he was drenched with perspiration and sobbing. Senator Borah drew the biggest crowd for his final argument, and this was when most of prominent citizens in Boise turned out in full force. It was actually at this point that the widow Belle Steinberg finally made her appearance, arriving with one of her sons. And it was described as one of the finest summations of Borah's life. 1,000 people remained outside, unable to get into the courtroom, straining to hear his speech. Then the judge instructed the jury, and it seemed that all of Boise could smell an historic hanging in the air. Prominent citizens had already begun planning a huge multi-day picnic celebration. Still, Judge Wood reminded the jury that Orchard's testimony required corroborating evidence of Haywood's complicity in that specific crime. He instructed them that they should view Orchard's testimony with skepticism if they believed it resulted from promises of leniency by the prosecutor. When the jury left the courtroom, Daryl weirdly confided to a newsman, "It only takes one." The jury returned, but first, there were just reports coming out. After only 4 hours, the jury sent a note to the judge. A quick agreement on a verdict sounded like bad news for Haywood, but the panel only wanted to review some exhibits. As they proceeded through the night with their deliberations, Daryl paced and listened to talk that the jury had gone from 7 to 5 for acquittal to 10 to 2 for conviction. Then shortly before dawn, someone standing outside the jury's window overheard an 11 to 1 vote and ran to a newspaper office. Daryl heard the raucous celebrants in the street and purchased his own copy hot off the press. When he read that only one juror still held out for acquittal, his heart sank. At 6:30 a.m., the attorneys were summoned to court to hear the verdict read. Daryl passed women and men in the street decked out in their Sunday best, giddy with excitement over the upcoming festivities. In stark contrast, both Daryl and Richardson appeared lead-footed and downcast. When Haywood arrived from his cell, Daryl told his client to prepare for the worst. To Haywood and his counsel's surprise and relief, the eavesdroppers got it backwards. The jury had leaned all night toward a defense verdict. Early that morning, the last holdout for conviction changed his mind. Hawley registered shock as Haywood won acquittal for lack of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It was the miners who then declared a holiday, hoisting Daryl on their shoulders as they paraded around amid outraged locals who spread rumors the jury must have been bought off. Others, like President Roosevelt, speculated that the jurors feared reprisal if they convicted the hero of the violent labor union. Elated socialists across the nation quickly proposed Haywood as their presidential candidate. Anarchist Emma Goldman sent President Roosevelt a telegram, "Undesirable citizens victorious, rejoice." Hawley and Borah blamed the result on the judge's careful instructions. Jurors themselves indicated that they focused on the need for corroboration of Orchard's testimony. So, Pulitzer Prize winner J. Anthony Lucas, in his epic history, Big Trouble, came to the conclusion that this was the trial of the century. I cover its highlights much quicker than he did. His is over 700 pages. If you want to read a really lengthy discussion, I only have a chapter in The Sky's the Limit. I note the extraordinary significance of this case, but I concluded that an even more significant trial of the century, testing the soul of the nation, occurred in 1968, that barely avoided nationwide race riots and galvanized the diversification of the American jury that we often take for granted today. And I also cover the Haywood trial with another death penalty trial associated with the labor movement from a 1910 deadly bombing of the Los Angeles Times building. And that's covered in With Justice for Some. That presented an even more challenging case for Daryl and cost him his license to practice in California. Yet he went on to a number of headline cases that drew international attention. And I just wanted to mention in closing that you probably have heard of those, and probably more than you've heard about the Haywood case, the Scopes monkey trial, the defense of Chicago teenagers Leopold and Loeb, a Detroit murder case that gave birth to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Sweet case, which was near and dear to Daryl's heart, and a murder trial in Hawaii in the early 1930s at the end of his career that ultimately launched major political upsets when Hawaii became a state. So I commend to you those other cases too. But I was very glad to be able to research and write about the Haywood trial. I learned a lot. I'm open to questions.
All right, folks, you are more than likely to place your question in the chat, and then Camille or I can relay it to Judge Pearlman, or if you want, you can just go ahead and unmute yourselves if there's a lull and ask the question yourself. Questions still coming in. I see kudos are coming in as well. What a story, amazing amount of information and interest. Brava to you, Judge Pearlman.
Thank you. In the meantime, before we get the questions, I'll just tell you a little about what happened next. They did try Pettibone. And before they tried Pettibone, they decided to prosecute the former witness, Steve Adams, who had changed his mind, who had been convinced to withdraw his confession. Daryl came back from Chicago to defend Adams and was able to get a hung jury. And then Pettibone was next. And Daryl was very sick by then. He was doped up nightly, fighting the flu and severe mastoiditis. And he wound up in a wheelchair in court. But he commenced a brilliant defense, and when he could barely participate anymore, his doctors ordered him off the case to recuperate in California, and his co-counsel won Pettibone's acquittal. And after that, the prosecutors decided not to go forward with Moyer's for charges against Moyer. So that's how that all ended. And actually, that fall, Borrow was preoccupied with charges of fraud against him and the deceased Governor Steinberg for a real estate fraud case that was brought by the federal government, and he was defended by Hawley and won acquittal.
We have a question that has come in through the chat. What was the general tone of coverage by the Boise media at the time of the trial?
Well, that would be a good question. I didn't really fully investigate the Boise coverage, but my assumption is that it was very pro-prosecution. Of course, Hawley had just been mayor recently, and the local authorities just basically favored the prosecution, as did most of the leading citizens of Boise, which was the capital, and the current governor had already expressed his view that they ought to hang. As did the president of the United States. So there was a lot of focus on that. The people who supported the workers were mostly on the periphery of society, the socialist causes.
So I will go ahead and ask you a question if I see a lull here. As a judge yourself, how do you view how the trial was carried out? Do you, in your estimation, was it argued appropriately? Did the decision come down appropriately? Would you have done something different as judge?
Well, I think the judge did the right thing. He gave the proper instruction. The prosecution was not happy with him doing that, but he gave the proper instruction. When you talk about the case as a whole, both sides, but it was no holds barred. There were illegalities on both sides. The judge, I would say, was not acting totally ethically by going on fishing trips with a reporter, but he handled the trial properly. And I think the result is proper. It's really hard for people to understand that there are legal limitations, and one of them was that this needed to be corroborated, and that didn't happen, not in court. So I thought it was also interesting to see the difference between the two defense lawyers. Daryl was much more effective in cross-examining the chief witness. But he was the newcomer to town. And so he started out more deferential to Richardson and wound up not being so at all.
I'll go ahead and ask another question. So in the year, so what ultimately became of Harry Orchard, and did he ever? I mean, obviously he went to prison, but what did he ever speak about the trial or the case later on in his life?
You know, I think he did, but it's been a while since I looked at that, so I don't recall specifically. I mean, he was quite a character. I mean, he went under various names, and he was, you know, championed by the prosecution, but he was really a violent man who had engaged in all kinds of illegal activity. I don't specifically recall right now. I do recall what happened with Haywood and Moyer. And of course, Borah went on to be a longtime senator. And actually, Hawley went on to be a key member of the Idaho Historical Society after he retired from politics. But it's, as I said, it's been a while since I thought about what happened to Orchard. So I just don't recall the specifics.
That's fine. And I believe Haywood eventually defected to the Soviet Union, did he not?
Yes, he did. What happened was that Haywood was much more radical than Moyer, and so they split shortly after this trial. But Haywood went on to head major strikes over the next decade as a leader of the IWW. Well, by the time the United States got into World War I, President Wilson went after anyone associated with radical unions, including Haywood. And there was a major arrest of IWW members, and just for disseminating literature. And he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he made bail pending appeal and fled for Russia. And he spent the rest of his life in Russia, and he was actually very disillusioned by the Soviet dictatorship. Because it wasn't what he imagined. But the Soviets did give him a hero's funeral and kept half the ashes in the Kremlin, and they honored his request to have the remainder sent back to Chicago to be buried near Haymarket Square martyrs who had inspired his lifelong battle.
I have a question here from the chat. As an aside, can you recommend a biography of Mary Harris Jones?
Good question. I have only read articles about Mary Harris Jones. I have not read a full biography, so I guess you'd have to go searching online for that, but she was an amazing woman. Her family was involved in the Great Chicago Fire. She lost her home, she lost her children, she lost her husband, but she spent the rest of her life fighting like hell for the living. So if they recommend one, I would be happy to look at that too, because she was an amazing woman.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions from the crowd?
I will say that Debs in World War I was also convicted for making an anti-war speech. President Wilson was able to, he had new legislation that he used to deem treasonous just the use of what he considered to be disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language. What Debs went to jail for was later disavowed by the U.S. Supreme Court in later decisions, but he did go to jail during that time after the Supreme Court had already upheld his conviction as a wartime necessity. They later said that the First Amendment's broader than that. So it was that's what happened. But he had run like 5 times as a socialist for president.
And never got close, right?
No, never got close. I think no, he got in the teens maybe of the vote. But as a third party, it was a pretty significant vote for him.
Right.
Now, I will say one thing, all the immigrants who supported the Western Federation of Miners leadership in 1907, what they were encouraged to do was buy buttons and said undesirable citizen. And they wore those buttons all across the country saying, identifying with the defendants.
That's good stuff. Well, this has been wonderful, Judge Pearlman. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, but as I want to thank you first of all for coming and speaking to us, and I'm sure many more of our museum members will enjoy the recording of this that we send out. And with your permission, then I will also send out the audio files or links to the audio files that you played if people want to hear those more fully as well.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to imagine what it was like to watch a parade like that with 40, 50,000 people marching, wearing red bandanas. And, pretty soon you couldn't do that. The laws were changed to make it much more restrictive on parading. But it was showing that made Teddy Roosevelt very concerned.
Understandable.
Thank you.
Fascinating. No, thank you. Thank you so much. And actually, it looks like we have one more thought from the chat. A recommended reading list would also be nice. I don't know if that's something that you want to comment on right now. If there are other books besides yours or besides the ones that you referenced that you would like to recommend to our readers.
Well, if they're just focusing on this trial, there's Lucas's book, and then there's a shorter book I could recommend that just focuses on this one trial. But Lucas did an amazing amount of research for his, and I don't have the name of it. Let me see. Just take a second if I can. Maybe I can find the other book.
If you'd like, also, you'd be welcome to send me a couple of those listings, and I can cull the list together and send it out.
Okay, the other thing I can recommend is Douglas Linder's Famous Trials website. He's a professor of constitutional law in Missouri, and he has he has entries for various famous trials, and one of them is Big Bill Haywood. So that's something else I could recommend. But I will send you information if you want. Roughneck was the name of the other book I was thinking of.
Say again?
Roughneck.
Roughneck.
Yeah. But of course there are a lot of books on Daryl, and they, I referenced, I read a number of different sources, and some of them were newspaper articles of the time. But it depends on what they want to focus on. If they're focusing just on this one trial or the whole history of those labor wars, Lucas does go into that.
Well, whatever comes to mind that you would recommend, yeah, send our way, and we'll pass it around. That's great.
Okay.
Okay.
And they're referenced in my book in the bibliography. So.
Perfect. And are there, if you have links as well to where we can find your book and purchase it online too, then we
Or Amazon.
Great.
Amazon.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you. And it was a very enjoyable opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I'll do what we like to do here and recommend. We'll have everyone unmute yourself real quick here, and then we can give Judge Pearlman a proper round of applause.
Thank you.